welcome to Distant Echoes, episode 15, Red Tape and Delays. Before we get into the episode, I need to issue a quick correction. In the original posting of the previous episode, I was calling the Curaçao Pueblo formerly known as Santo Domingo, Quirez Pueblo. This is incorrect, and it is in fact Quewa Pueblo. I have gone back and corrected this error and added a disclaimer at the beginning of the episode. This appears to have originated from a typo in my research notes for the last episode where I mixed up Quirez as a linguistic or cultural group and Quewa, the name of the pueblo. The names of some pueblos have changed compared to what they were when some of my sources were originally written, and I've done my best to correct this when I've been making my notes, and somewhere along the lines I mixed up Quewa and Quirez. I do apologize for getting the names mixed up. Last time we talked about the Spanish expansion to the northern frontier and the establishment of the mining districts of Zacatecas. We also discussed a swath of official and unofficial expeditions back to Pueblo lands like the Chamuscado Rodriguez expedition or that of Castano and Gaspar de Sosa. This time we'll talk about the background of the expedition that would finally get the green light to establish a colony in New Mexico. A map of this inevitable Oñate entrada is on the website. As we mentioned in the last episode, Philip II of Spain would issue a cedula calling for the establishment of a colony in New Mexico in 1583. Many people would put in for this honor, most notably being Juan de Oñate, Francisco de Urdaneta, and Pedro Ponce de Leon. Urdaneta looked like he was going to get the job for a time, but after running into some legal troubles, he would drop out of the competition. It is possible that one of his rivals for the job fabricated these troubles so that he would get the honor instead. At the end of much competition, Juan de Oñate would get the job, meeting with the Viceroy of Mexico City and signing his contract on September 21st, 1585. Before we get into the contract and the details of the expedition, let's take a quick look at Oñate's background and qualifications to lead. Oñate's father, Cristobal de Oñate, had been a lieutenant governor of Nueva Galicia. You may remember that he even filled in for Coronado as governor while Coronado had been on his expedition. After that, sometime in the late 1540s, Cristobal would head to the north, hoping to establish settlements like Zacatecas in the northern frontier. As we mentioned in the last episode, he would marry somewhere in the range of 1549 to 1550. Juan de Oñate, the second of 5 sons, was born sometime between 1550 and 1552. Juan would receive some education in the heartlands of Mexico, but the vast majority of it would be at Panuco, where his family had an estate. In the 1550s, the Chichimeca War, which lasted for the next 40 years, would begin. Oñate would participate in various raids against the Chichimecas during this conflict, helping him gain military experience he could lean on later in life. It also appears that during this time his plan was to become manager of the family mining operations. Cristobal de Oñate would die in October 1567. After his mother's death, Juan would inherit the family estate. Sometime in 1580, Juan himself would marry Isabel de Tolosa Cortés de Moctezuma. After the cedula was issued, the Viceroy of Mexico, Luis de Velasco, would encourage Oñate to apply for the right to colonize New Mexico. Viceroy Velasco may have chosen Oñate for a variety of reasons beyond their friendship, including his connections, wealth, or service record. Overall, the terms of the contract were simple. Oñate was to provide the royal fifth, which was 1/5 of all profits go to the royal crown, supply 200 armed men and their families, the tools needed and trade goods needed to set up the colony in New Mexico. In exchange for these services, he would be made Captain General of New Mexico and Governor. He had tried to make these titles hereditary, but in the end would fail. And in addition to these titles, he was also to be given a yearly salary of 6,000 pesos and 3 artillery pieces. Any colonist that remained for at least 5 years in New Mexico received the lowest noble title of Hidalgo. In total, including civilians, there'd be approximately 600 people on the expedition. He would be given some autonomy, as he would report to the Council of the Indies and not the Viceroy in this role. Essentially, he was creating a new viceroyalty. He used familiar connections to prepare the expedition, including recruiting some of his relatives, Juan de Zaldivar, who would be the Maestro de Campo, and Vicente de Zaldivar, who would be the Sargento Mayor, or Lieutenant Marshal. Father Diego Marquez would also help with planning for the expedition. While all these preparations were going smoothly, things would start to turn south. In September 1595, a new viceroy would be appointed. Velasco would appoint Oñate governor of New Mexico before he left office, though. This new viceroy would give conditional approval to Oñate's contract. The new viceroy would then begin to drag things out before letting Oñate leave on his expedition. It would get to the point where in December 1595, Oñate would write to the king asking for help getting the ball rolling a little faster. Furthermore, the new viceroy also edited the contract. The biggest loss would be placing Oñate under the viceroy and not the Council of the Indies. Oñate would appeal this change to no avail. These delays would make all the men that Oñate had gathered restless. The whole thing looked ready to fall apart before it could even start. But with these changes, his contract was finally ratified and he could set out. Planned to begin north in the spring of 1596. Lope de Ulloa would be tapped by the viceroy to be the inspector of the expedition. The point of the inspection was to make sure Oñate was actually holding up his end of the contract. To do this, he would accompany the expedition from Zacatecas to Santa Barbara, where, as we've seen, so many other expeditions got started from. Oñate was wary of Ulloa at first. He hoped to be really underway by August 1596, and to be done with the inspection by then. By summer that year, they were finally underway. Oñate would send a small party ahead to arrange things for the main group, but they were moving. It was progress. By August, they were still working their way through Nueva Vizcaya. In early September, they would stop to rest for a few days from Santa Barbara. While resting, a courier from Mexico City would arrive, carrying orders that Oñate's contract was suspended while the crown considered another proposal. This proposal would be from Pedro Ponce de Leon. Oñate was able to convince Ulloa to keep these new orders secret for the time being. He had fears that such a revelation would be the end of the expedition before it could really get started. The reason for these new orders was twofold. First, due to the meddling of one of Oñate's rivals for the expedition, the viceroy had started to write the king in late 1595 with concerns about Oñate's fitness for duty. The second reason was that the Count of Bailen, Pedro Ponce de Leon, began to show interest in the venture. He had some 2 years' experience in the New World, and a prestigious ancestor who had named Florida. He would take Oñate's contract as the model, take the numbers, and just simply increase them. By September 1596, Ponce de Leon had been chosen over Oñate. The plan now was to give Oñate some government posts to make up for the costs he had incurred to date. However, Ponce de Leon would get sick and run into trouble trying to raise the money he had promised, going so far as to have to try to mortgage his estate and ask the crown for a loan. The viceroy's letters also became more favorable on Oñate, so the king flipped again. It is possible that Ponce de Leon was related to the same rival of Oñate's who had been slandering him to the viceroy. Oñate had also pleaded his own case to the viceroy, writing that, quote, "The moment they learn that a change has been made and that the expedition is being taken from me and given to another, not more than 20 persons will remain," end quote. And he would continue, quote, "What has most strongly moved these people to accompany me on this journey was my long association and acquaintance with them, which would not be true of a newcomer," end quote. While trying to sort this all out, supplying his men had also started to get more difficult. He had asked to be allowed to move to Santa Barbara, where he thought he'd have an easier time getting supplies, but was denied. He was allowed, however, to relocate to the mines at Caxo, arriving in the start of November. Desertion had begun by this point as morale hit rock bottom, and people started to think Oñate wasn't going to be their leader. Even worse, the discipline of his men began to break down. While hunting down deserters, a captain would attack a native village that may have belonged to one of Oñate's rivals, capturing 2 women as hostages. This issue would eventually go to court, and then to the viceroy, who would just let the issue die. On December 9th, Ulloa finally agreed to do the inspection. During the 2 months of the inspection, it became clear that Oñate had brought extra of nearly everything. During the count of the men, Ulloa would be promoted to commander of the Pacific Fleet and would leave for the Philippines. An assistant would complete the count. The final count for this first inspection came in at 205 men, although that count may not be perfectly accurate. As for their equipment, those with it still wore armor despite its waning days in Europe. This was a Pyrrhic victory at best, though, as much of the funds available to Oñate had been spent just keeping the whole thing together. Critical funds that would now not be available for the colonization effort. Furthermore, several of the friars had thrown in the towel and left the expedition. Finally, in April 1597, he was given a cedula that freed him to go to the north and establish the colony, as long as he underwent a second inspection. The new inspector, Juan de Frias Salazar, would be late, arriving in November of that year after even more desertions. Salazar would let the power get to his head. As a result, he and Oñate would not get along. Salazar declared that the expedition would start to the north and that he would inspect them when he wanted. Getting going took time, though. Supplies had been stored in warehouses while the expedition waited. Wagons needed repair, and the normal inertia of moving a camp. It would take about a month to get started, but finally, after over 2 years of red tape, Oñate could really get going. After leaving Santa Barbara, Salazar declared the inspection would take place at the San Geronimo River. It occurred December 22nd, 1597, and lasted until January 8th, 1590. By the time it was over, everyone seemed to hate Salazar. He had found a fault with every perceived slight, such as one event, quote, "At one point, a young recruit had passed by his tent and inadvertently neglected to use his cap. Incensed at the sight, the inspector ordered him flogged," end quote. Oñate would come up short some 71 men and 2,300 pesos. Luckily, there were provisions in his contract that Oñate could make bond for these shortfalls. He got some aid from one Juan Guerra and made bond for the rest. This done, Oñate asked if he could get going. But Salazar was not done, demanding that Oñate agreed to recruit and guard 80 more men, which would put him above his agreed-upon number of men. Luckily, these men could be recruited and sent to the expedition later, but if Oñate failed, he forfeited everything he was promised as part of his contract. Salazar would accompany the expedition to the Conchos River, which the Spanish would find running high. Rather than turning back and trying to find a different route, Oñate crossed the river on his horse to try and raise morale. He would also lead a cart across, and the rest of the expedition would follow. While they were crossing, Salazar finally left, which I'm sure led to much rejoicing. Although Salazar left without giving Oñate a certification, which was normally given after such inspection. Oñate would send some 30 men to escort Salazar and ask why he had not given them the certification. Salazar would refuse the escort and offer no explanation as to why he did not give the certificate. Oñate would then write a letter to the viceroy explaining all the problems he had run into over the past 2 years. But finally, he was free. While they were crossing the Conchos, they would build a set of rafts out of cartwheels covered in branches and bark so that they could bring the sheep across the river. After crossing the Conchos River, he would continue on to the San Pedro River. Here he would take a break and send some men back to get the replacement friars. War had broken out between the Spanish and the Tepehuacan, and the friars would need an escort. Captain Marcos Farfán de los Godos was sent to get the friars and would return some 3 weeks later in early March. These friars were led by Father Alonso Martinez and contained 10 total priests and lay brothers. This break to get the friars also let Oñate send some scouting parties ahead. Unlike previous expeditions, which tended to follow the Conchos to the Rio Grande and then cut north, Oñate was trying to take a more direct and faster route. Furthermore, the Indians on the lower Conchos were hostile, most likely due to Spanish slaving raids. This new route he would chart due to this expedition would become part of the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, in English, the Royal Road of the Interior, and this section would also be called La Ruta de Oñate. The Zaldivar brothers would be chosen to lead the scouting party. They would take 13 men and 3 guides. Immediately they would get lost until they saw some smoke and were able to capture 4 guides. Eventually, half the men would be sent back due to lack of supplies, with orders not to tell the others how hard the path was. On February 28th, the scouts would arrive at the Rio Grande. During this time, Oñate would get worried and send out a relief party, which would find the scouts in bad shape. They would scout the nearby mountains and find them to have more supplies, and that route would be suggested to Oñate. On March 10th, the scouts would return, and Oñate would immediately depart. At this point, they were still in Chihuahua, and the spring growth had not yet begun, limiting pasture. They arrived at the Rio Sacramento and took a short break. Here they constructed a chapel and prayed. He then sent out another scouting party. Along the stretch ahead, they found many waterless sections. One of the chroniclers of the expedition would write the following about their trip through this section. Quote, God succored us with a downpour so heavy that very large pools were formed. Then we unyoked the cattle, and they drank. Therefore we named this place Socorro del Cielo. End quote. A week later, they arrived at the sand dunes of Los Medanos. They spent several days along the edge of these dunes, but in mid-April, they were forced to cross. Due to the sandy terrain, they would move half the carts at a time. Along the stretches when he'd meet up with Zaldivar once again. After giving the oxen some time to recuperate, about 25 miles from El Paso, they would send the oxen and the captains back to bring the rest of the carts and people. Here they decided to take a week's rest. One of Oñate's men would describe the fertile lands they rested in as such. Quote, it seemed these were the Elysian fields of happiness, where we could forget our misfortunes and enjoy those comforts so long denied us. End quote. At the tail end of April, they continued along the Rio Grande, looking for a place to ford the river. They would find such a place on April 30th. After finding it, they built another chapel. Oñate, in front of the notary, officially took possession of the province of New Mexico. Thus, on April 30th, 1598, New Mexico would come into being. They then celebrated the occasion. Captain Farfán de los Godos enacted a drama he had written. No record remains of what exactly the drama was, but a center stage were the missionaries baptizing the pueblo. They then continued to the ford and crossed the river. Here they began to encounter the local Manso people, who made the sign of the cross. In early May, they camped somewhere near downtown El Paso. With the help of some Manso guides, they continued north, seeing some signs of previous expeditions like De Sosa's cart tracks. Some men who had been with De Sosa even confirmed these tracks. In early May, they would continue up the Mesilla Valley, which extends from modern Radium Springs to eastern Texas. Oñate then summoned Pablo de Aguilar for a scouting expedition. Aguilar was to go north until he encountered a pueblo. He was then to investigate the situation, without entering the pueblo or being seen, similar to the orders de Sosa would have given. The reason for this order was that Oñate was concerned that if the Spanish presence was discovered, the pueblos would take their food Oñate desperately needed, and would leave. If the men did break this order, he threatened the death penalty. Of course, just like with de Sosa, these men ignored their orders and entered the pueblo they encountered. These men would be spared, however. Since the pueblos knew of the Spanish approach, Oñate decided to take 60 men ahead with him to try and assuage any fears the pueblos may have had. The Zaldivars, some priests, some of the men's wives, and the 8-year-old Cristobal de Oñate would accompany him to the north. Francisco de Sosa Penalosa was left in charge of the main contingent of the expedition. Shortly beyond the point where he broke off this contingent, the Rio Grande makes a U-shaped bend to the west. Deciding that this added too much time to the trip, Oñate instead decided to traverse the 90-mile Jornada del Muerto, The expedition would write about their trek through this harsh section, quote, "We all fared badly from thirst," end quote. During this trek, they would often have to send men to the river to get water for the horses. One night a dog came back with muddy paws, allowing them to find some watering holes. They'd also find some metates that had water in them. They would be slowed due to one of the priests suffering from a bad case of gout, and the wagons had trouble making it through the sand. But eventually they'd make it to Qualacu, the southernmost Piro pueblo. The Piros would abandon the pueblo, brandishing their weapons. Oñate would send them some gifts and make camp. Both of these actions would calm the Piros, who returned to their pueblo. Oñate would remain at Qualacu for several days. The main expedition was having trouble traversing the Jornada del Muerto, and there was dissension among the officers. Eventually, Oñate would be forced to go back and meet the main thrust of the expedition with some corn. By June 12th, he had taken control of the situation and was able to return to Qualacu. A storm would roll in during their march. One captain, Gaspar Perez de Villagra, writing, quote, "The elements clashed in terrible combat, as the entire earth shook and trembled beneath a veritable downpour of rain, accompanied by such mighty claps of thunder that we were terrified." End quote. He would then describe just how quickly the storms could be in New Mexico. Quote, "God took compassion on us, for the skies emptied as suddenly as they had become clouded, and the sun shone forth bright and clear." End quote. As the expedition continued through the Piro pueblos, they would find them abandoned and devoid of food. They'd eventually find a large pueblo named Hepana that still had people in it. The local leader of the pueblo, named Litok, would tell the Spanish that they wished to be friends, offering them a gift of corn. The Spanish would name this pueblo Socorro, the nearby modern settlement of Socorro getting its name from this pueblo. People of this pueblo would also give Oñate valuable information on what lay ahead for the Spanish. He would send some scouts to the east while he continued north to a pueblo they would name Nueva Sevilla. Here he would wait until their return. The Spanish would sleep in the local kivas, hoping that it would be a defensible location that would protect them from any potential attack. With the scouts' return, he would push on to San Juan Bautista, arriving around June 24th. Here they would stage a mock battle. After this, a man who spoke some Spanish would approach the expedition. He would mention some names that the Spanish thought could have been people left behind by previous expeditions. Oñate would continue onwards, finding more abandoned pueblos without food. He was starting to get concerned that these areas would not be safe for the rest of the expedition, and that he would be unable to buy the supplies he so desperately needed. The next inhabited pueblo they would find would be that of Parore, near modern Bernalillo. Here they would find whitewashed murals depicting the martyrdoms of Frays Agustin Rodriguez and Francisco Lopez, who, if you remember, had stayed behind during the Chamuscado Rodriguez expedition in 1582. Oñate would swear his men to secrecy on what they saw in the Kiva. Supposedly there were 2 Christian Indians living at the pueblo of Kewa, formerly known as Santo Domingo. Oñate would continue on to this pueblo, arriving at night to take them by surprise so they would not flee. He would catch the 2 men, Cristobal and Tomas, who both spoke good Spanish. They claimed to have come with De Sosa, and remained behind by choice. Oñate would call for a grand council of all the nearby pueblos at Kewa. Out of curiosity or fear, the leaders obeyed the summons. On July 7th, using Cristobal and Tomas as interpreters, Oñate would explain the main goal of the expedition, to convert the pueblos. He would then ask them to kneel and kiss Father Martinez's hand and render obedience to them. They would do both of these and then return to their pueblos. What messages these people gave to their pueblos is not recorded. After a couple days' rest, he would send one of the Zaldivar brothers back to guide the rest of the expedition to a valley the Spanish called San Juan Valley, where he planned to make his capital. There are several reasons he may have chosen this area for its capital, including its central location, perhaps friendlier relations with the local pueblos, more food from the local pueblos, or even due to rumors of trace amounts of silver in the area mentioned by Coronado. Either way, without ever seeing the area, he would set out. The Spanish would leave the Rio Grande. They would ascend to a plateau at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the southernmost extension of the Rockies, and then stop in the lower end of the valley of San Juan, now known as the Espanola Valley. On July 11th, he would reach the pueblo of Oque and its companion pueblo Yungue. They would name these pueblos San Juan. Today, this makes up the pueblo of Oque Owingue. Later, Oñate would give this pueblo the full name of San Juan de los Caballeros. In 2005, this pueblo would officially change its name to its modern name of Oque Owingue. Keep things simple and avoid confusion, I will solely be referring to this settlement as Oque Owingue, as I have in earlier episodes, although many older resources still refer to it as San Juan Pueblo. Overall, the Spanish recorded friendly relations with the people of Oque Owingue. People living in one of the 2 pueblos would clear out a part or all of their pueblo for the Spanish. How willing they had truly been to do so isn't recorded. Some of the other settlers also likely built lean-tos for shelter. Oñate would then tour the northern pueblos, prospecting for ore along the way. He would make it all the way to Taos, finding some promising ore, but not large amounts. He would then return on July 19th and then set out for Pecos. On his way to Pecos, he would meet with the main thrust of the expedition at Kewa Pueblo on July 27th. The expedition planned to rest at Kewa until August 1st, and then would continue onwards. He would then tour the Jemez pueblos, finding a silver paten, a dish used to hold the Eucharist, that was probably left by previous expeditions. He would then return to Okeowinge by August 10th. While waiting for the rest of the expedition, he managed to get some 1,500 people from the nearby pueblos to begin digging the acequias, or irrigation ditches, for the future city he planned to call San Francisco. The rest of the expedition would arrive on August 18th and would begin to prepare for winter. For supplies, the expedition got these from pueblos in the area. With things finally starting to look up for Oñate, I think we'll leave him here preparing for the future capital of his new province.
If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled engineeringfire.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. And thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.